Good morning. Welcome to our continuing series on leading from the top session with Joe Thompson and Vicki Updike with differentiating strategies. Today, our topic will be changing culture and understanding the culture you have, whether it's done in a proactive way or a reactive way, and trying to understand that, how to identify that, define it, and advance that. So I know we have participants joining us right now, so it'll I follow that to see how the numbers come in. I'm not sure if they all come in at once or they come in slowly, but it looks like they're coming in slowly. But in any event, what we'll do, like we've done every other session, we will allow participants to ask questions. Use the tab on the bottom of your page to ask a question, and I think Vicki and Joe will be monitoring those and answering those as they go along. So if you do have a question, please use that feature and ask those questions, and they'll address that. And again, this is the first of a two-part series, changing culture now, and then for session 1 and session 2 on I think it's November 12th, if I have that right. It'll be talking about accountability, which is a great topic. So with that, Joe, Vicki, you can take it away.
Okay. Well, I'm going to, if I can get the presentation here, or capability here, I'll put up our presentation we're going to use for the day. And Mark, am I up there?
I don't see you up yet, Joe. I think.
Okay. Do I need to do something on my end to do that?
Mark, I think that's a technology question.
Joe, do you have a share screen button?
Okay. Thank you. I do. Okay. No. Okay. Have we got that? Is everybody seeing the changing culture up there?
The screen is up and live.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank John and Mark and Vicki and I would for the opportunity to partner with them on this. We've been doing this for 5 years and putting together this ongoing series for those of you that are sitting at the top of organizations. As John mentioned, if you have questions, I'll be running the presentation. Vicki will be monitoring for our questions, and both of us will be participating in this presentation. We'll be talking about changing culture today. The first thing we wanted to start with is we've always started these presentations on leading from the top from looking at this from a leadership perspective. And that is that there are different views from different places in the organization. And the further up you move, the broader the view and the further out you have to look in terms of trying to determine the outcomes and the capabilities. The further down you go into the organization, the more you get caught up sometimes in tasks and managing those tasks or picking work. So we're going to be talking about this culture change from the perspective of a leader at the top of the organization. And the reason is because culture begins and ends with the executive leadership. It is an artifact of the way that the organization is being led. What we want to do today is to give you some insight and hopefully have you come away with 1 or 2 things that you might be able to do that'll allow you to be more proactive in changing the culture in your organization to the kind of culture that you want it to be. First, when we look at the definition of culture, it's sometimes one of those things that we talk about, but we don't necessarily have a definition for. So we use a lot of metaphors and analogies, and we actually do talk about culture ourselves when we talk about it in terms of place, purpose, and the practices. But one of the simple ways of looking at it is culture is whatever your employees describe it to be when they think that you're not looking or not listening. And that may be at a fish fry on a Friday night, 2 or 3 beers into it, but I guess maybe we're not doing as many fish fries on Friday nights these days. But I think you get the gist of this. This is what people really feel and believe about the culture and the organization and the relationships in their environment. So when we look at culture as leaders, the framework for the culture of the organization is defined by its aspirations. When we talk about aspirations, what we're talking about is the vision, which is what we're trying to accomplish that constitutes success. We're talking about the mission, which is how we're going to go about it. And we're talking about the values, which are the boundaries defining what's the path we're going to take. Those things are really essential to culture. And when there's a disconnect between any of those things and the behaviors in the organization, that will ripple throughout the culture. So when we're beginning to look at culture, one of the first things we look at is there a concise statement on vision, mission, and values? Excuse me, I have veils up there. I just saw that now, sorry. Vision, mission, and values, because what happens if those things are difficult to understand because they're a paragraph long, if nobody knows what they are, it's hard to be able to rally an organization around those things if we don't have them clear and understood throughout the organization. And what Vicki and I are going to do is, rather than read through a group of slides, we'll put some up there as placeholders, but we'd like to be able to share with you a case study, a story having to do with a client that we worked with that was working to try to change their culture. In the process of doing it, they really exhibited a lot of the principles and had some of the experiences that are common to other people that are trying to do this. And we're hoping that that will resonate with you a little bit more than going through and hitting a bunch of PowerPoint notes. But one of the things that we would like you to think about as we go through this, and we'll talk more about this, is the way the leaders, in this case, starting with the president, communicated the shared values, how he connected and made this relevant to individuals, and how he and his team looked for commitment on the part of individuals in order to get them engaged in the actual practices that are here. And this isn't a linear thing where you do one, do the other, and do the third, but rather it's these three things work together as the leaders worked with the people to try to establish the culture. So, Vicki, did you want to give an introduction to this, our case study here with the situation at the time that we arrived?
Yeah, hi everyone. So this was a well-established manufacturing company, a bit smaller, I would say about 30 employees. But you know, the president reached out to us because he could not get strategic initiatives moving forward. He couldn't get good traction on strategic initiatives. So, and so as we continued to peel the onion on what was going on, you know, the president shared with us that, one, they had a policy book or online, just a huge list of company policies, and and nobody was really following them anyway. And so there was a lot of contention about, what those really mean. How do we really go to work each day? And it got to the point where the president, who is a very personable guy and really likes working with people, did not want to interact. He didn't want to walk the floor. He didn't really want to hear the complaining, I guess is how, and he is trying to establish where the business is going and trying to get people to work differently together.
So some of the things specifically that he saw happening was he was getting approached by people with a lot of what he considered almost petty concerns, but those petty concerns arose out of some of the policies they had. For instance, there was concerns about should people be using their telephone on the shop floor or not. There were differences in some of the tenured employees versus some of the newer employees as far as their attitudes about work and whether or not once a machine was running, you had to be by it all the time or you didn't. There were people who tended to view the schedule as being somewhat flexible, and there were others that thought that it was clear that it needed to be very prescribed schedule. In addition to that, the workers felt like they were in the dark as far as what was going on in the organization. And yet the boss felt like he was on the floor, even though he was not having a good time like he had before, not enjoying it as much. And what began to happen, or what he saw happening, is there was almost a passive-aggressive approach to addressing these issues, is that people would confront him and complain to him about what somebody else was doing and not paying attention to going and talking to the individual. As Vicki pointed out, he was unhappy, he was frustrated, and this wasn't just an emotional thing. He was losing some of his good people. They were leaving the organization in order to take jobs with competitors. And this was at a time when he had an opportunity to grow the organization, but was missing some of the personnel and losing personnel that were necessary in order to be able to realize that growth. Oops. And what was happening here is his intent was right. He recognized he needed to change the culture. He recognized many of the things that we were talking about. He was smart, he was aware, and that's one of the reasons that he reached out, is because he felt like he was pulling the levers but wasn't getting the response that he ought to be getting from them. And when we came in to talk to him, it's always easier coming in from the outside, because it's really hard when you're in the middle of it. When you're the person walking that floor, when you're the person sitting in that meeting, when you're in that environment all the time, it's hard to stand in the middle of the field and see the perspective on the whole field. So that's one of the things that we were able to do. And I think if you're dealing with a situation where you're trying to figure out what's going on here and what's happening, for you to be able to bring somebody else in, whether that's somebody that's a trusted advisor that you have, but somebody else that can help you kind of see what's going on. Sometimes those things aren't things that are real radical as much as they've just become part of the landscape, and they're hard to pick out. But what we saw was, as we watched what was going on, is we saw people listening, but not verifying that they understood what the other person was trying to say. So what happened is they would listen, and then they would apply their own interpretation to it. And this was happening throughout the organization. So somebody would be thinking that they had a conversation and talked to somebody and had resolved something, and the other person would walk away with an entirely different understanding of what that was. The leadership the president and his executive team were providing a lot of information. People were complaining that they didn't know what was going on, so they kept putting out more and more information, but they weren't communicating because there wasn't a shared understanding of what is it that people needed to hear, and also where were they at and how were they interpreting that. He wanted to be proactive, and he wanted his team to be proactive, but they were going through what uncharitably might be considered a set of gimmicks. They were trying different things, but those things weren't resulting in engaging the individuals within the organization. And because they had so many of these squabbles between individuals on things like the phone policy and going to the break room and things like that, is a lot of times what they were doing is they were really trying to fix things that they saw as wrong with people, but not really uncovering what the issues were there. And with the proliferation of policy, layering policy after policy was just making things more confusing, not really clarifying anything at all. In the end, the individuals within the organization weren't quite sure where they stood. And that's one of the reasons that they were losing people, is people were frustrated with the situation, but also because they could tell that the president was agitated and the president wasn't happy, they interpreted that as the company was in trouble. And that was just the opposite of what was happening in that organization at that time. So, Vicki, do you want to walk through the first steps here?
Sure. So one of the first, communicating. I mean, we talk about it all the time, right? I mean, we as leaders, we talk all the time. And what we find as leaders is that you really have to, your communication and what you're saying is similar. I mean, it feels like we have to say the same thing over and over again. And in today's environment, I cannot iterate enough that communicating is one of the most important things you can do. And communicating, as it's defined, is not just giving information. It is also listening and ensuring that they received the feedback. So communicating is the number one thing that we can start doing to influence the culture. And one of the things that is to move slow. So slow, Warren Buffett was recently quoted saying that busy is the new stupid, which I've been saying that all the time. I mean, I've been re-quoting him all the time because, slowing down, actually respecting the conversation, respecting the mode of conversation and communication is actually very respectful, but it is a sign and a way that we can increase strategic thinking and critical thinking in an organization. So when you are communicating, it is important to slow down. And then the next is clarifying the issue. So, so often we think we're answering questions, but if we were to reiterate, well, what is the business issue we're trying to work through today? And clarifying that up front leads to so much saved time on the backside of the communicating process, just because it's like, oh, I thought we were talking about that. Well, let's go back to the beginning. So clarifying those business issues and ensuring that we're talking about the same thing. Next, in communicating with your people is verifying the messages. That you're going to get signals, you're going to get mixed messages. It's okay to say, help me understand, and for you to ask your team to verify what they're saying to you, because and the last thing you want to do is the already listening, right? Where your people start talking, it's like, oh, okay, we're going to talk this old issue again. Show that respect on listening and verifying their messages. And then the ongoing dialogue. We don't have to make communicating an event. So how can you stay close to your people today And that's so important because today, although we are busier than ever, we are isolated in a lot of cases, and the ongoing dialogue is so important. And that and just checking in to see, one, to verify the message, and two, that so you're listening to their messages. Joe, what did I miss?
Well, I was going to build on that. One of the things we're talking about is with more of the remote working situations, as we work together in a team, as we work together in proximity to each other, there's this ability to kind of reassure and reinforce each other. But when we're working alone, that same dynamic isn't there. And, you know, as Vicki talked about, the busy is the, what the new normal.
The new
Yeah.
stupid, yeah.
You know, what happens is when things are unusual, when things happen that you don't expect, a lot of times we look around and we try to get other perspectives, but when we're not able to do that as readily because of some of the remote situations, or we're not able to do it as readily because we're in a situation that's very dynamic, that keeps changing and that we've never seen before, we get anxious. And when we get anxious, what happens is our natural reaction is to fight, to flee, or to freeze. And that drives us to move faster rather than slowing down and going, you know, what is going on around us. So one of the things that the president did in this situation is he started asking people to step out of that busy environment on the shop floor and just spend a few minutes with him in his office. And he started asking them, what are the concerns that you have? And he asked questions to try to uncover that and peel that onion. But he also asked them, because he ended up getting a really long list of things. And his first response was he got anxious and decided, I need to start doing some things about this. But where he started to get traction is where he turned around and then asked them, what are you willing to work on? What are the important things to you? And all of a sudden that long list, which when you get a really long list, you have to separate what's venting from what are the things that are really important. And he began to see that there was a difference between the things people were venting about because they were anxious, because they were frustrated, and the things that were really important to them. And that allowed him to be able to get to see that there were some common themes that he was going to have to address rather than this long laundry list. But the other part of it is by asking them what they were willing to work on, he was basically inviting them to move from being the critic to start being the playwright in this culture. Because he could talk about what he'd like to see in the culture. He can set vision, mission, and values, but in the end, if the team doesn't adopt those, in fact, if everybody on the team doesn't start to step up to the role of being a leader, you end up with something that is basically top-down driven rather than lived throughout the organization. And that's the difference between adopting a culture where people participate in it and trying to get compliance with a group of policies. So one of the things he needed to do was, instead of trying to explain what he was trying to do, he needed to go to where the team was, where each individual was, and to try to understand where were they right now, and then start the discussion from where they were, because it may not be possible for them to be able to get to where he was in order to start the discussion. So in the end, instead of just walking through and talking about work things, he challenged his team leaders to not just talk about the work, but to try to find out what's going on in the people's lives. And what they began to find out is some of the people that were pushing for or taking some of the flexible, flexing in terms of when they come in and had some home situations that they were trying to deal with, but they didn't feel like they could approach anybody with it at work because they didn't know how to fit into the policies. Plus, there wasn't the conversation occurring throughout the organization to talk about that. They didn't feel like they could approach that. They were asking what the team members thought about things. How would they solve problems? How would they approach things? And what the first step they did is they started reducing the number of policies that they had. And what they began doing was talking more about what are we trying to accomplish here, and began talking more about boundaries and less about policies. And so one of the boundaries would be, for instance, that we want to make sure that we get the work done. But, you know, if we do that a little bit differently because some people come in early or some people stay late, that's fine. That's within the boundary, even though it may be different than what some of the policies say right now. And those boundaries then became really the manifestation of what the values were. And so they were checking on what do these values mean to you, to everybody. The team leaders themselves, he asked them to begin conducting regular meetings with the team. And they, we adopted the word huddle for it because most of them felt meetings were practical alternatives to not getting anything done. So they used a little bit of a different nomenclature, but what they did as part of that was they lasted about 10 minutes. They were at the beginning of a shift and they had them about once a week unless there was something else that they wanted to announce. And what they did is they talked about where the company was going. They talked about how well it was performing, so that not detailed financials, but that we're doing well, we're making money this month, things are going well. They usually had a spotlight on one customer, that what that customer was using their product for. So they had a sense that we're making airplanes safer, or we're helping people with cutting their grass, or whatever those things were. And then they also had at the end a team member moment. And what they did is they highlighted one team member who had an issue or had a problem, and in some cases where they made a mistake, and they talked about what they learned from it and how they attacked it. And what that did is instilled in the group a sense of that when these things come up, we should be the ones that go out there and do this. So instead of saying it, what they did is they demonstrated it through the things that the team did. What happened outside those formal meetings is instead of coming to the supervisor and saying, this guy's talking on his phone, people started walking across the aisle and talking to the people about it, and found out that there were different ways of looking at it, where one person had spent 15 or 20 years and had been trained that you stand by the machine all the time and you don't do anything else. Another person had been taught that once you get this thing set up and running, you just need to keep it running. So if they go ahead and check in on their phone, as long as they're safe, that's okay. And what happened is rather than debating over what the right way is, people started talking to each other to understand those different views and those different perspectives. And there was kind of not everybody behaving uniformly, but people understanding why people behaved a little bit differently. Vicki, anything else?
Yeah, so connecting it. So, you know, as you start looking at culture and especially as the workplace has changed today, you know, communicating is absolutely critical, and then connecting, which is harder to do today. You know, a lot of us don't have the manufacturing floor or the, you know, the pop-ins we can do to check in on people. So go where the team is has to be more intentional today to step in, and it's important that your frontline supervisors know that this should be more intentional, and you know, and establishing boundaries and in culture is so important, and Joe talked about it. But the boundaries in today's environment different. So in a lot of us, we have remote work, we have remote workers, and how that's changing our culture is absolutely is happening, whether you're controlling it or not. But it's important to reestablish what these boundaries are. You can have a remote workforce and still have boundaries. And so what are those boundaries? Because it is, now more than ever, people are feeling like they are doing everything all the time, all at the same time, especially if they're at home. So what are those boundaries mean? So the example, of that connection through our case study was absolutely the thing that turned the leadership around. It's not just to, as Joe said, implement more policy, but it's truly to kind of throw the policy out and say, well, what's going on and what can we do to best solve this, instead of telling people what's happening.
So, and I see this, at least I see this in my own home, with my wife, who's works out of Atlanta. She's not traveling down there anymore, but she and her team that she works with frequently just go offline together on a conference, and they talk about, are we doing anything that is that we shouldn't be doing? Are there things that we can be doing better? And they kind of set up their own set of boundaries as to how they work together, because she doesn't have to worry about this unless our granddaughter shows up, but a lot of them have young kids. And they just came right out and said, hey, if you have a kid bouncing around on the bed in the background, that's okay. And if you can't make this, this meeting during regular time because they're trying to help somebody with school, let us know. We'll go ahead and figure out something at 7 o'clock at night or something. There's been just a really kind of that understanding that has transcended being there during a normal set of work hours in a common environment, and had kind of a blurring together of the needs of the family, the individual, outside of work with the person inside of work. And it's become a lot more, for her in those situations, a lot more personal. And we're seeing that more and more with people where, we recognize it's more about getting the job done, and we're going to have to be more flexible about how we go about that. And to understand that, we do have to have that connection with what's important for people.
Mm-hmm. And I would say that, some more pointers on how best to do this in a workplace. I think it has to be more intentional. So if there are, I was just talking with someone yesterday that we are doing too much through electronic communication, and that is having, we don't want to interrupt, so, the basic phone call has gone kind of to the wayside. Everything's a FaceTime or a video, but we have been relying too much on email, just, because people have different work hours and because people are working through different scenarios at home. But I think that face-to-face touch base or that phone call just to check in has to be more intentional, but it doesn't have to have a subject line, and it doesn't have to be a half hour. It seems like everything on our calendar. So, put the 5 minute, just check in with your team. And it could be, a quick FaceTime call, or, a lot of us are using Microsoft Teams and different things like that. There's ways for us to just do a pop-in and just say, how you doing? What's going on in your place? How can I help you? Are just that less structured way to stay close to your people at home.
And that use of a shorter time and a less structured time was one of the reasons that we adopted the word huddle rather than meeting for working with that group, because the huddle was something that was somewhat ambiguous as to what it meant. And so the team could make it whatever they wanted it to be. And, as Vicki points out, it doesn't have to be in those discrete blocks. Those discrete blocks on our calendar are the time planning equivalent of policies. And if we can move back and say, well, what do we need to do? I've been in a number of meetings lately where, maybe huddles, but I've been in a number of interactions lately where instead of thinking about it as a half-hour thing, it opened up with what are the things that we need to decide here, and what's keeping us from making those decisions in the first 5 minutes and then getting back to work.
Mhm.
And so it allows that kind of flow to occur. So if somebody is dealing with some other things, that they don't feel like they're locked into this particular convention of time. Once we've begun to communicate, once we begin to have a shared understanding, once we begin to be able to go beyond just informing with emails, for instance, and start really having a back and forth about what do we mean, recognizing that just because we understand something doesn't mean we have to agree on it. There can be still differences on things. And once we start to connect with what is important, that starts to sort out the noise from the really important things. The next part of it, if you're talking about a culture, is to be able to have commitment. When we talk about culture, what we're really talking about on a larger scale is relationships. When you have a relationship, a friendship with a person, the way that you interact with that person creates a culture. And it may be one of that's based on openness. It may be one that's based on something that's more formal. But as you get together with more and more people, as we do when we have a work environment, really what we're looking at is a sum of relationships and the way that people regard and treat each other. So part of inherent in any relationship is what is the commitment that you have to this. And so what we're looking at is really a shared commitment on the part of the leadership in being consistent with these values, but also on the part of the people that are constituents in the culture, in their commitment to trying to make this work. And I use the word trying to make it work because things just keep changing all the time. And sometimes what worked 3-4 months ago isn't going to work right now. But as leaders sitting at the top, you want your people to be trying those new things and not to be waiting for you to go ahead and propose, here's what we need to do, because you need them to come up with different ideas. That's where your innovation is going to come from. That's where you're going to see them go ahead and step up and take care of things before those things maybe even come to your attention. That's the kind of thing that started happening within that organization we were working with. So what we found is these internal policies, as they were replaced by these boundaries, people worked together to figure out how it was going to work out. They made agreements between themselves, and those agreements may have only applied to one part of the organization. It may have only worked on the loading dock, or may have only worked in shipping, but that's what they did. They took and figured out how to make it work in their particular area without anybody coming in and saying, well, here's what the procedure is, or here's what the process is. They took care of it and took ownership of it. Team members, normally what would happen is the work would come in, the supervisors would schedule it, come out of the office, it'd go down to the floor, and they would work at it. All of a sudden, that line between those various groups started blurring because people that were doing the work were coming back and saying, if we did it this way or this way, we could actually get more work out, because you're causing us to have to make these changes, whereas we can go ahead and keep this flowing if you went ahead and just let us do it this way. And what happened is they started actually seeing the delivery times improve, and they saw the amount of time that went into making some of the products they're making decrease. Of course, this is manufacturing. And the way that presents itself may look different in a service industry. It may look different in a restaurant, you know, or other venues. But the idea was they started seeing themselves more as part of a larger team working to get things done. And there wasn't a hesitancy to walk into the office or to walk out on the floor, because that's one of the things that when we arrived, Vicki and I we never saw anybody from the floor in the office, and we never saw anybody from the office on the floor. It was like it was two different companies separated from each other. One of the things that was really cool, and this was something that was illustrates a number of these things, is one of the groups of employees actually, because they were challenged to figure out how to solve different problems and do different things, they took on the how do we grow the business problem, which is kind of interesting. But they went out and were, in talking to customers, found out that there was a need, that if they bought another piece of equipment, that they could meet that need. And not only did they come back with that as a proposal, they came back with an estimate of how many different orders that they'd be able to get, because they'd already talked to the customers, and they did some research and found out where they could go find that piece of equipment, about how much it would cost, where to install it in the footprint, and what the workflow needed to look like around it, materials coming in and out. And the president told them to work with the CFO and come back with a proposal. And they went through and did that, actually installed that piece of equipment and ended up filling it up. But it was something that other people wouldn't necessarily have seen, but they saw it because they were now talking to each other and seeing themselves as empowered as being able to make that kind of difference. So we're not just talking about small things happening on the floor. We're talking about that's something that's, for that company, would have been a major strategic initiative to pursue a new line of business with an investment of that much capital. So it was really, it really was a change. The other thing that happened is the people that were leaving a number of them who had left called up and asked if they could come back. They said that they heard things had changed and that this was the place to work. And they went from having trouble recruiting people to where they had more people applying than they really had work for at that time. And that was a complete reversal for them, and something that they were trying to make some improvements. They had not realized how far that could go by going ahead and making those changes to their culture. And that had a tangible impact on the bottom line. That was not a feel-good thing. That was something that really allowed them to be more successful as a company, to be able to talk about that we're going to be around, and you don't have to worry about the stability of us, because we're continuing to grow as a company. Vicki, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, committing. So this is, so as with culture though, the actions of the leadership team are what drive culture. So, so the only way these can start happening is if it starts with the leadership, and that it must start with, the president and the executive team, and it's not just talking about it, it is doing this. So this whole component of building trust, the only way you're going to get trust of your people is if you start giving it first. And so as a leader, you really need to start exuding that trust in people before they start then reciprocating that trust. And that is really hard to do, especially in a leadership role. And it's hard because it puts us in a vulnerable spot, but to give that away is the best way to start building the commitment for where the company is going. And the other thing is that I would just add, Joe, is that without trust, embracing conflict feels like politics. So
Yep.
this whole component of I disagree with you. I don't feel I'm being heard, and I don't even trust that you're listening to me. Then it just is a political game. So you, as a leader, you need to address that when it happens, be transparent when you see it or hear it, and fix it. And the only way you can fix it is to exude the correct behaviors. And go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was just going to say, I think what you're in talking about trust and in talking about conflict, to recognize, to trust each other enough that when there is conflict, which is nothing more than a different perspective on the situation, that's not threatening to you at all. That's not saying, you're inexperienced or you're stupid or you're wrong. It's just saying, I see it different. And that recognizing that's really an invitation to have a dialogue, because there may be some things that I understand that I haven't really communicated to you, or there may be some things you understand that I would benefit from knowing. And that's a whole different thing than locking horns that you get from that fight, flight, freeze response.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The other thing in talking about that is with trust and with building culture, as a leader, you want a culture that includes everybody. You want to make that culture one that not only the people that are there, but the people that are coming into it, that you make a conscious effort to make sure that those people are given a chance to participate, are not just invited, but they're brought into that culture. Because if you don't do that, if you rely on that to happen passively, you're going to end up with people that are in the culture, and you're going to end up with a counterculture. And so your company, instead of being united with a common culture, is going to have subcultures throughout it. And so I know the word inclusion gets thrown around a lot now, and I think but there's a lot to that. If you want to have an organization where everybody's pulling together to make sure that you're doing the things that are necessary in order to not just onboard people in terms of the types of things that they need to do with their work, but also to help them understand what is the vision, what is the mission, and most important, what are the values. In a lot of cases, that means helping them understand how broadly that they can operate and still be in a good place, and recognize if they make mistakes, if they make errors, that errors only become mistakes when you don't learn from them. And each of those represents a learning opportunity for the individual as well as sometimes for the organization. And as you do that, that's what makes culture inclusive and welcoming, and really is a business benefit for the whole organization. So Vicki, do we have any questions that have showed up?
Well, we had one that asked if there's any pointers on how best to do some of this in a remote work environment.
I think my first thought would be is I think when you're in a remote work environment, some of the things that we're talking about here need to be very explicit. There's ways of doing things sometimes where you model behavior and people watch it, or you the practices behind trying to be deliberate with your culture lean a lot more on the use of words than they do, say, of watching other people do things, because that's harder to do. So I would, if you're trying to engage in this in a remote situation, which most of us to some degree or other are doing that, make sure that you've established a common language when you talk about this. And one of the reasons we like use communicate, connect, and commit. We could describe this some other ways, but it's easier to remember: communicate, connect, and commit. It's alliterative. And then we can turn around and we can talk about what does that mean. So you may have to spend more time, you will have to spend more time on the front end, making sure that you're explicit about some of these things and what the expectations are. And throughout the process, pointing out when examples of where that's working or where you're seeing victories, because you aren't sharing the same space physically with other people. So trying to take it and simplify it around some language that you can agree to, that people can understand, is going to facilitate your ability to do that. Vicki?
Yeah, I would say another, in this communicating and in committing is consistent messaging, especially from the top of the organization. As you are asking for change in behavior or want to exude more trust or embrace more conflict, this consistent messaging is because you're going to be tested. They're going to, your employees are going to be like, oh, well, we'll wait and see. Or, there's going to be these points, well, does she really mean it this time? And it takes you exuding those behaviors over a period of time and with consistency where it starts happening. When Joe was saying about countercultures, I would like to say that is no culture. So it is really essentially, it is people assuming and doing as they assume. So this intentional, and to make it very intentional, especially in today's space, is more important than ever. And without the walking the floor, and I'm not sure how many leaders, I didn't do that very well when I was a leader. I didn't really, go out and walk around but if that's part of what you have done and how you want to stay close to your people, you're going to have to find that way to instant message and get in on a chat and just say, and embrace their work and embrace their timing. And it also helps you gain that agreement. What are we doing and when will we be done? And having them give that back to you. But no doubt it is harder as a leader to stay connected with your people. So the consistent messaging and intentional moments is important.
And don't underestimate the importance of explaining to people things that might seem obvious to you. And that may mean you need to talk to some of the people as you communicate a message and say, can you just play back to me what you're hearing? So, and a lot of times there's multiple things associated with it. Masks have been a big discussion these days, and people, do you, don't you? But a number of people that working with, they turned around and said, look, we want you guys to be healthy. We want our customers to be healthy. We want to be able to not see problems, and that's why we're asking you to wear a mask. I mean, they stated it not in terms of here's the policy, we expect you to do it, but rather in terms of what was their intent in doing it. And it was, a genuine concern over making sure that the people were healthy. And yes, there was also an element of the continuity of business that is associated with it. There's the idea that you don't want to have a reputation as a place that had an event, but when they communicated that in that way, it really kind of changed what was a bit of a tug of war that was going on over that particular issue. And then it was left to people to talk about among themselves, and the group self-adjusted, and it wasn't, was it different than what they did before? Yes, but now they basically have adopted that. In the case I'm thinking about, have adopted as part of the culture. And that's just what they're going to do for hopefully not too much longer, but that's
right. But in that case, Joe, safety is one of the values. So they're living their value, and that has to change over time. So that's where, your values, and following those in today's environment are very important. And a lot of, I know, so I would, you as a leader, sit back and look at your values and say, how am I exuding those in today's environment? And just kind of doing that self-check might be a good place to start, just to ensure that you are giving that consistent messaging.
Yeah, I think as you do that, you're going to help really continue to build that trust. You're going to be able to help people connect and get that inclusion, that ability to feel part of things, that ability to feel that you can participate in shaping the way the organization is going. Because the truth of the matter is, you do need everybody to be participating to shape where the organization is going. Were there any other questions, comments, Vicki?
That's it for now, Joe.
Okay.
But we could still take questions. So please, if you have questions,
if you
go
have
ahead.
more.
But I think it's good. Let's go to the next slide, Joe, because I think this would really wrap it up nicely.
Okay.
Yeah.
We wanted to close with a couple things here. And one of them is that your culture is going to keep changing. It was changing before this major change we had with the pandemic put pressure on us all. It's going to keep changing coming out of that. So this really is a skill that we need to have as leaders, is to be able to keep adapting the culture. Vicki, you want to talk about the next couple?
Yeah. So, if you want a culture, it needs to be inclusive, because if you don't include everyone, then you don't have a in sync culture. You have, disparities throughout the organization. And so this inclusivity is everyone understanding their role in achieving the results that they're looking for, everyone having a voice in achieving that. How are you exuding those values to be inclusive of all people? And then, as we always, Joe and I say this a lot, in strong cultures, everyone is a leader. And leadership is not a title. Leadership is the skill of leading. And it is important that you grow that in everyone, and you ask that of everyone. And that's really where you can have influence, and your voice is heard. Strong cultures, that's where strong cultures continue to evolve. And it all results from the combination of relationships. I mean, business is personal, and it's more personal now than it's ever been. And so for you to understand where your people are at, and meet them where they are, and then where they want to go, and how they can impact the culture and the performance of the company, is absolutely critical. But again, culture has to be intentional. If it's not intentional, and when I say intentional, I mean it has to be exuded by the leaders and the top leaders of the organization, and it has to be consistent.
Well, we wanted to thank you for taking the time to spend an hour with us this morning on this topic. We'd also like to thank the Chamber for being able to partner with them in providing this executive development opportunity. This is a subject that we could have a real long discussion on, but it's also one that you may have some specific questions on. So we invite you, if you would like, reach out to us. We'd be happy to have a conversation with you about this. If there's some specific questions we weren't able to answer, something that you might have been either reluctant to bring up or that you thought about afterwards, we're out there on LinkedIn. You can get our contact information from the Chamber. I know we had it at the front end, but we aren't handing out these things right now. But I think we recorded it, so if you went back and looked at it, you could see where our contact information is. But we'd be happy to just continue the discussion and do what we can to help all of us get through this together. So thank you, and Stay well, everyone. John?
Okay, thanks a lot, Joe and Vicky. Good program as always. You know, Joe, you mentioned we've been doing this for 5 years now. I mean, that's amazing how the time has flied. This has been a great, high level type programming that, we can only do because of, expertise like yours, Joe and Vicky. So that's much appreciated. So, we're continuing the leading from the top series. The second part of this program is on November 12th at 8 o'clock. It'll be a virtual Zoom offering again. So we'll virtually see everybody, and that topic will be on accountability, and it's the second part of this. As Joe did mention, we are recording this, have recorded it. It will be on our posted on our website. So if anybody wants to go back to it and refresh yourself, certainly do that and share it with others. We want more and more people to see this. So with that, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you on the 12th at 8 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.